So what I'm going to speak about today is threats and rising occurrences from both a geopolitical standpoint and also honing in on APAC. So when I say from a geopolitical standpoint, I'm not going to be talking about today the ice that's melting, say, up at up within the North Channels. So I'm not going to speak about icebreakers and Russia and the change in what will be supply chains globally through that channel. But what I will be speaking about today is more in line with what's occurring within APAC and what could be a probable situation going forward into the next 5, 10, 15 years. So the process that we're going to be speaking about today is from looking at COVID and what occurred throughout the COVID period, how that was working, how that functioned. There we go. Maybe something might work in a moment. And then on to the problems with recession and the problems that have been occurring with multinational organizations through lack of funding and a run via investors in terms of what we're seeing at the moment with a lot of large multinational corporations panicking at the start of half two of 2023. We've got a lot of organizations at the moment that are running around trying to be profitable at the end of half one, the end of quarter two. And that's a significant problem because what we're seeing at the moment is acute job loss, both in technology companies, financial institutions, which hence have a massive impact upon the supply chain, and that all veers around geopolitics and economics globally. Obviously, you can't see what's on the screen at the back of me at the moment, or should be. It should give some colour to it. So, in that arc, what we've got at the moment is a view and a look to a change across the geopolitical landscape between a harder rush of the United States and a Western viewpoint and a more Eastern viewpoint, which is mostly the determination of infrastructure around China and how China has managed over the past 30 to 40 years to have a real strategic business vision in terms of, and geopolitical vision in terms of implanting into infrastructure, implanting into supply chains, and implanting into the economic section, which is a fantastic strategic business decision for them and a fantastic geopolitical situation for them to be in as well. What I could have done is shown you something. There we go. At last, technology is a wonderful thing. There we go. So what I was talking about a moment ago is obviously the sanctional problems and the culture problems and the culture war problems that we've got. We've got an ideological problem at the moment between East and West and then the centric regions as well, which is why geopolitics at the moment doesn't fit together right and why the economy's gone slightly off kilter, because we have had 2 years of slowdown, non-profitability, and an arc to conflict within fairly on global terms. So when we look at it regionally, there is a specific issue and problem off the back of what was COVID and what currently is, because any pandemic can have those specific issues. But with the world shutting down for 2 years, what happened was an economic downplay a recession across every arc, and societal problems and societal issues that occurred within certain countries where individuals within those countries had to be furloughed. Then there's the forgotten conflicts that are certainly occurring at the moment, such as Syria, the Myanmar issues that we have as well. And in Myanmar, obviously, you've got a lot of raw materials, rare earth materials, timber. There's oil up there as well, gold, gas, etc. That is all going over the border into China at the top. FATF at the moment have blacklisted Myanmar. So that means that within Myanmar, can't actually do any business, any legitimate business outside of that country, move money in and out. There are certain business processes that people have been utilizing to get money in and out of that specific state. However, that's very problematic because you run into APAC sanctions, which can be devastating for a business if you find out about, because you'll have your assets reclaimed via the US. And then we've got the problems that have occurred through large organizations investing into big technological firms on big bet statuses, such as the FTX marketplace, which was $1 billion, almost $1 trillion organization that was an offshore fraud vehicle. What that has meant is that the entire industry, i.e. the crypto industry, and the multinational corporations that have invested in them have lost out on billions of dollars of revenue, which means that it's had direct impacts upon you, your organizations and governments that is not reclaimable. They can't pull this money back in. It's almost disappeared. Then you had the fall, because of these technological stakes that have gone on, into Credit Suisse, Silicon Valley Bank, Signature Bank, First Republic Bank. These financial institutions are actually propping up a lot of the financial institutions and also the companies, shipping or otherwise, that are within the APAC jurisdiction, MENA jurisdiction, and globally. So what you've got off the back of that is a lack of equity and a lack of capital, which means that you are not going to have any substantial recovery because there is no money floating about in the system, which is what I was stating at the start of this presentation, is that what has actually occurred is that large multinational corporations are running about at the moment in a panic and doing wholesale fire sales of businesses. So the geopolitical chessboard, what are they looking at? What's their problems? What are they focusing on? What's the United Nations, through its donor structures, focusing on? Because the United Nations and others, Interpol, who I previously was an employee of, outside of their main task, they are funded via donor countries and donor organizations. So as a result of that, there are priorities on that dependent on the world geopolitical view, which impacts upon the supply chain process. So what does it think about this region? What does it try and focus in upon? What does it look at? So at the moment, obviously, you've got the problem in Myanmar, and then the run-through from Myanmar into the top of Laos. Into the top of Laos are millions of individuals crossing that border who are then placed into scam centers, human donation for those stock that are good to be able to actually donate from. You've got problems in terms of the region again, turning into the Golden Triangle proper, not just that limited myopic view of what the Golden Triangle looks like. And you've got Captagon going through the borders between the top of Myanmar and China. And within that, you've got strategic plays to be able to run to various economic follow-through into China as well. So the US has actually missed its mark here greatly. So what happens then? What do they focus upon? How can they focus upon it? What can they do to mitigate that particular risk? ESG, environmental, social, and corporate governance. Okay, so what people do at the top level when they're looking at bonds and financial processes, they go, I know what we'll do. We'll invest in carbon credits. We'll try and offload that. We'll blame it on the shipping industry, the transportation industry, and the extractive industry. So the extractive industry then, as well as being sanctioned in various regions, then starts to be blamed for economic and ecological disasters. And then throughout that lovely supply chain, once those extractives are dug up and they're added value to and they're changed into different commodities, we've then got this issue where people actually want to, and we were speaking, or rather the colleagues up there earlier on were speaking about digitalization. For digitalization, once we've digitalized our supply chain, pretend for just one moment that the geopolitical world actually crumbles properly. What will happen with our energy processes, where we're going to get energy from, because we're tied in on a lot of occasions politically into contracts with certain nation states. Those certain nation states control the energy. The digitization process, the more we want digitization, the more that we're reliant on certain states for natural resources, i.e. rare earth materials. So those rare earth materials, those rare earth minerals that are all in our wonderful phones today come from certain locations in the world. China, Myanmar, Africa, etc., often places that are either sanctioned or part of OFAC control limits. However, we're all utilizing these devices. And once there is a geopolitical kickoff, where can we then get those goods from? How can we power these devices? Is there any fallback? Are we utilizing old-style equipment and kit because actually some of this equipment has been turned off, or we cannot access, like we couldn't throughout COVID, the natural rare earth materials because the supply chain stopped? So all of these risks have got to be factored into what you're doing in the future. Judicial, legislative-wise, this piece is what the large geopolitical landscape is looking at in terms, and I'll come on to the due diligence element of it in a moment, is the old style of company frameworks, familial company frameworks that we're most often very connected with. And so when geopolitical organizations, law enforcement, corporate bodies, corporate investigators, entities, this is what they're looking at. Mixed-use addresses, volumatic business, transportation, what families look like, what companies look like. This is part of your risk framework when you're dealing with your supply chain. Sanctions is a massive problem at the moment. And then what do they look at? They don't just look at that, they look at this, underlying layered accrual, and where money goes and how it flows, and what it looks like. So part of my skill set is as an anti-money laundering specialist. As an anti-money laundering specialist, this is kind of week one, day one processing. Trusts, offshore ventures, connection mixing, smurfing, asset processing, commodity swaps, shell companies in various different locations. And when I say shell companies in various different locations, that used to be really easy to set up a shell company, keep yourself nice and quiet, no problems. Not anymore. I work for Thomson Reuters, as I said. We've got all the data in the entire universe. I can very quickly look up somewhere in the British Virgin Islands. Not an issue. Hawala processing, i.e. the old standard of movement of money between certain individuals. Again, that's quite easy these days in corporate webs and layers. When you're factoring in about what your risk processes are throughout your supply chain, you need to be factoring in these thoughts as well. Not just the physical nature of what a supply chain process looks like. Because that's quite, that you can see, you can feel, you can hear, it's tangible. All this stuff is not tangible. It's actually the business processes. So that's the reason for when you are, I deal with quite a few chief financial officers, chief executive officers as part of my current role. I advise them on risk. And this is what I speak to them about. Okay, what does your business truly look like? What are your connections? It's a big thing. Because one day your boats might be seized by the US government. It's not something that you want to happen. So where's to watch? Let's come back to physical a moment. Let's come back to geopolitical. Where's to watch? Let's move away from Taiwan. Let's move away from Russia for just one moment. Let's move to Papua New Guinea and the Solomon Islands. So Papua New Guinea has just signed security and military base processes with America. Previous to that, the Solomon Islands, both rich extractive nations, have signed it with China. Okay? This is going to be a very large, distinct problem because it only takes one itchy trigger finger from some marine from Alabama to cause a geopolitical conflict that could spread globally and throughout the world. There are national analysts scrambling around at the moment trying to mitigate this problem because it's going to be quite large. It's just above Australia, as you can see, which is a Five Eye country, so it's part of the intelligence community with America, the US, Canada, etc. And as that, it had certain protections. Okay, it's just above Australia. I've been to both locations. I know what these locations look like, feel like, sound like. And then you've got a consistent conflict within Western Papua as well, via armed guerrillas, etc. And I expect a lot of you have business within that region. So, looking at that and looking at what could possibly be the future is that you've got a country, a theology, a culture that's very, very strategic, okay? And very, very business-minded. And actually, in some ways, more corporate than what the US could be deemed to be. So what does it have? It's got most of the world's ports as part of political agreements and liaisons. It owns most of the world's ports. Shipping, the Greeks are almost matched in the shipping process now. The infrastructure, so energy, roads, millways, and then the rare earth minerals, okay? So it's just made, that's been very quiet at the moment, and some people haven't been watching it, but it's just made an agreement with Brazil, one of the world's largest economies, to do straight credit swaps and then to decouple from the dollar and to couple with the yen. Now that's a massive thing because that is on the road to de-dollarization. That's one of the main strategic arms for the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, the road to de-dollarization. Once you de-dollarize, who's then going to connect with America, and how far does America slip down the line? That also factors in to trade and trade credit. Where are you going to get your trade credit from? Or where are organizations that move their goods throughout the world going to get trade credit from? What purposes, for what reason? Because it's becoming tighter and tighter, and this leads on to trade surveillance and trade credit. Because although China is strategic, the US and its Western partners are very, I want to say bureaucratic, but China are in themselves, but they arc upon the rule of law, due diligence, okay? And this is what they're looking at the moment, the analytics of organizations, looking at it visually, how big is your network, what does it look like? They're digging into the supply and the shipping chain in full, i.e. the problems with the F-35, Honeywell, etc. That was dug out through one of these processes. That was a $1 billion deal with supply chain processes all over the world globally being deconstructed. And these are the type of questions that they're asking. Are you being tainted as an organization, even 7 levels down? Do you have any problems, any conflict areas? Dual-use goods that you're evading? Are you swapping lanes at sea or at different ports? Are you utilizing the right channels? Are you interlinked with various commodity processes? These are all the processes that they're asking in terms of sanctions and problems. I'll come on to a quick one. This is all open source. I'm not telling anything out of school here. So Myanmar civil war, the sanctions that occurred from that, you've got an individual and a group from Myanmar that is interlinked in and throughout the APAC region and then globally throughout the world in relation to their supply chain. But how resilient is that supply chain to these specific threats? I'm very unsure. So he's been accused, and his group have been accused of organised crime, genocide, corruption, fraud, movement of weapons, goods, armaments, etc., payoffs. Forfeiture of 37, that's nothing for this because it was in the billions. This is very simple. This is open source. This is easy stuff. So there's shipping, there's financial institutions that are linked around the world. There are minings, extractives, revenue sharing, donations in most of the countries around the APAC region. Singapore, Malaysia, Thailand, adversely affected by that. OCBC, which owns the Bank of Singapore. The Bank of Singapore is the private wealth hedge fund. For people that don't know, it's not like Temasek or GIC, but they're all interlinked. All these effects that go on a country because of supply chains, people, places, things. So I hope you've enjoyed this very rapid presentation. Apologise about the technical problems at the start and my rambling at the start of this presentation, but I hope you've all enjoyed it. And I'll be sat on the next panel if you want to ask any further questions. Thank you so much. Thank you.